Welcome. This week's film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's an American film from mid-70s. The director, Milos Forman, is Czechoslovakian, born and bred. He also directs Amadeus, and I do highly recommend that if you get a chance, you watch that. It's an amazing spectacle. It's a period piece, and it shows you, especially after you watch One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Mr. Foreman's skill as a director to do both a very small and confining film, which this is, and then something really large and celebratory as Amadeus is. What's pertinent about his upbringing is that both his parents die in World War II, Nazi concentration camps, and then he flees Prague, Czechoslovakia, in around 1968. And that's important because one of the themes in the movie here is authoritarian regimes, and it's in a soft way, it's a very, very much is making a political statement. The film is based on a book, a novel by a gentleman named Ken Casey. And Ken Casey has an interesting background in that he in his youth, spends time in a mental hospital working there. And they offer him the opportunity to be tested with LSD. At the time, it wasn't illegal. And he does it. And it changes his life and his path for the rest of his life. And what's interesting here is that he's more concerned in the novel about the expansion of the mind and what really defines crazy, where the director, Foreman, is more concerned about the individual as they relate to the community as a whole. So Ken Casey goes on to create a small group of folks called the Merry Pranksters. There's a good documentary that at least used to be on Netflix about them as they travel around the United States on this crazy kind of bus. We even see it reflected. Foreman picks it up as one of his shots in the movie. But the two of them are not buddies. They don't get along. I don't believe there was ever a time that they were both on the set at the same time. And one of the reasons is they have very different ideas about what the story should be telling us. The themes that we're looking for beyond the anti-authoritarian type of regime is these kind of themes that run through the 60s and the 70s. The counterculture still doesn't have a lot of power. They're not represented in government quite yet. So rebellion is a theme, and it's a theme that we saw in Little Big Man, certainly in Easy Rider, and then poking fun at the institution in the satire with Dr. Strangelove. So this too is about humans versus the institution. However, this film takes a step forward and kind of captures the rebellion, which is kind of the next step once you appreciate satire, and now we've raised these questions, what do we do about it? So Jack Nicholson's character in the film represents that next step. I'm not a big one for Academy Awards because they're most of the time so political, but when you get a film that wins 5 Academy Awards, you have to tip your hat to that and say they're doing something right. So they win 5 for this, and 5 of the most important, and then they're even nominated for the cinematography. So here again, like we had with some of our other films, it's an example of the 5 things that we study in film coming together. The combination definitely makes this better than any one of the individual pieces. And beyond that, it takes on some of these philosophical and political questions without really raising them. I mean, you need to know this a little bit going in to identify what some of these sub-messages are. So, as we saw with the satire, now we move into a rebellious state, and our character certainly does a good job of that. 2 terms that you need to know about, because we don't hear a lot about them today, but what, in fact, we don't really have mental institutions much anymore, but they were very, very robust at this time, and certainly through the 30s, 40s, 50s. If you were a little bit different, there was a place that they could send you, and you could be institutionalized. It's not a great part of our history, but it exists nonetheless. 2 things that they talk about in the movie. One is electroshock therapy, and we see McMurphy actually go through this process, and they would put these pads on the brain and run electricity through it, and it was thought to stimulate the brain and help with depression. And in this case, they're doing it because he won't conform, and that's really an important piece of the film. The other one is a lobotomy, and that's where they actually take out parts of the brain. There was a time when they thought that this would help people with mental illnesses. Unfortunately, when they remove parts of the brain, they can't get rid of just the part that they want to, and often is the case where the person is left in pretty much a zombie state. Electroshock therapy, it's called something a little different now, ECT, but it still exists. Probably more popular in Europe than here. And I doubt that they run the amount of current through the system that they did back in the day. Cinematography, Foreman really knows what he's doing. He has a wonderful eye, and most of this film takes place in the mental ward. They actually shoot in a real mental ward, so it's not a backlot Hollywood set. Great performances here from Nicholson. If he was somewhat light in Easy Rider, he's on the top of his game here in this film. Louise Fletcher, what's interesting here is that we have a strong female role, and she's actually an antagonist. So that's not common in our films, and it's often rare when we have a protagonist with a strong female character, but very uncommon when the antagonist is a woman, and she does a fantastic job. You also see a great performance by a gentleman named Will Sampson, Native American, and then there's a really good group of young actors that I'll let you recognize, some on TV today. Kevin mentioned this actually in one of his posts a few weeks back about the metaphor of water representing life, and he was absolutely right. And it's used very dramatically here in some of the closing scenes of the film. It's very intentional that this character, after what he has just done, takes and rips this sink out of the mental ward. and we see this flowing life force, if you will. All of this very, very intentional. Then one of the last things that I want to talk about here is buried in the film is this idea of what makes us human and what makes us an individual. So it was touched on in Little Big Man, especially when Dustin Hoffman was in the Native American camps. And in fact, that's what they referred to themselves as humans being. Here again, we see it come up, but not referred to in the same way. This now comes from Foreman's idea of when are you alive, what makes you an individual, and it needs to be more than just physical. There's an intellectual component to this that he believes, and it allows for the ending to the movie that we see. So those are things that I'd like you to pick up on. As far as contextual links, there's actually about an hour-long documentary that's really very good on the making of the film. It's broken up into 3 different segments. I think the first and the third are really strong. So if you only have time for 2, do that. If you only have time for 1, at least do the first one. But I do recommend it. It moves really well, and you get some insight into what a lot of the actors were thinking and the screenwriter. So we have that, and then I've even posted a few paintings, a few pieces of art from this communist time period that Foreman is in particular rebelling against. And look at the art and decide for yourself what role the individual plays there. Because that political system at the time, anyway, had evolved to the point where it was less concerned about the individual and more concerned about the group and the whole, and you had to supplement your individuality for the betterment of the group. And this is what we're going to see in this movie, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So have a good week. Work through the module as you have been, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.